There's a certain kind of dream that only the Olympics can create. A vision of flags fluttering, of nations united, of glory wrapped in light. For decades, that dream has seduced cities across the world. Each one believed that hosting the Games would lift them from ordinary to eternal. In the 1990s, the world believed the Olympics were pure, a festival of excellence untouched by greed. But behind the golden rings, something darker was already spreading. By the end of that decade, the illusion would shatter. And it would happen in a quiet American valley surrounded by snow. Salt Lake City, Utah. A place of mountains and faith, of clear skies and frozen winters. It wasn't Paris or Tokyo or Rome. It wasn't glamorous. But it had something the others didn't: determination, and the will to win at any cost. The story begins in the early 1990s, when the International Olympic Committee announced that it was accepting bids for the Winter Games of 2002. 6 cities entered the race: Schaun, Switzerland; Östersund, Sweden; Quebec City, Canada; Jakarta, Spain; Oulu, Finland; and Salt Lake City, United States. Salt Lake had already tried, and failed, to win the 1998 Games, losing to Nagano in Japan. That defeat burned deeply. It wasn't just a loss of pride, it was humiliation. The Utah delegation returned home furious and determined. They believed they had been robbed, not by a better city but by a corrupt system. So they vowed to understand that system, to learn how the IOC really worked. The International Olympic Committee was, and remains, one of the most powerful organizations on earth. A private club of about 100 men and women, accountable to no government, yet able to decide which country would receive billions in investment and global prestige. Its members lived like royalty. They were treated as heads of state wherever they traveled. They voted in secret, entertained in luxury, and answered to no one. For decades, the IOC had operated on handshake deals and unspoken favors. Officially, it was about ideals, fair play, friendship, peace. But unofficially, everyone knew how things worked. When a city bid for the Games, it didn't just build stadiums. It built relationships. Delegations showered IOC members with gifts, dinners, first-class trips, exclusive access. It was a culture of charm and indulgence, all perfectly legal, all hidden behind the polite language of hospitality. But sometimes hospitality crosses a line. Salt Lake's bid team was led by 2 powerful figures, Tom Welch and Dave Johnson. Both were ambitious, persuasive, and willing to do whatever it took to bring the Games to Utah. They studied what Nagano had done to win the 1998 Games: lavish trips, luxury hotels, endless gifts. They learned the unspoken rules. And then they decided to play the same game, only better. They began building files on every IOC member, where they lived, what they liked, their hobbies, their weaknesses. Some loved skiing, so they were promised VIP mountain vacations. Some had children, so their kids were offered scholarships. Some simply wanted money, and they got it. One internal memo would later call it relationship building. Another word for it might be bribery. Throughout the 1990s, Salt Lake's lobbyists turned the Olympic bidding process into something closer to a global campaign. They flew IOC members and their families to Utah for ski trips, first-class flights, 5-star resorts, limousine service. There were shopping sprees in Park City, college tuition for children, even plastic surgery for one member's wife. The expenses mounted. By the end, the bid committee would spend millions not on venues but on favors. Tom Welch called it investing in friendship. To outsiders, it looked like manipulation on a grand scale. But the charm worked. Salt Lake City was picturesque: white mountains, blue sky, wholesome families. It was the America the world wanted to believe in. When IOC members visited, they were greeted by crowds waving flags, choirs singing hymns, and politicians promising unity. It was impossible to resist. And so, on June 16, 1995 in Budapest, the IOC voted. Salt Lake City won. The crowd back in Utah erupted. Bells rang. People hugged in the streets. They had finally done it. On television it looked like triumph. Behind closed doors, it was something else entirely. For a while, everything was perfect. Construction began. Sponsors lined up. The city prepared for its transformation. But inside the Olympic movement, rumors began to swirl. Other cities, the ones that had lost, started asking questions. How had Salt Lake suddenly overcome so many rivals? Why had certain IOC members voted so unexpectedly? And why were so many of them visiting Utah long after the vote, still receiving gifts and invitations? It started as gossip, idle talk among journalists and staffers. But then documents began to surface. Receipts, letters, bank transfers. In December 1998, a package arrived at the IOC headquarters in Lausanne, Switzerland. Inside were copies of financial records, and a list of payments made by the Salt Lake Bid Committee. The total? More than $2 million. When the news hit, it detonated like a bomb. The Olympic movement, the sacred institution of fair play and honor, was suddenly accused of corruption at its highest levels. Television anchors spoke the words Olympics and bribery in the same sentence. Newspapers ran headlines like "Gold for Sale." The IOC tried to downplay it at first. President Juan Antonio Samaranch called it a misunderstanding. But within days more evidence emerged. Dozens of IOC members implicated, their families receiving money, gifts, trips. Some payments had been funneled through fake scholarships, others disguised as consulting fees. It was no longer rumor. It was proof. Investigations began on both sides of the Atlantic. The U.S. Justice Department opened a criminal case. The IOC launched an internal inquiry, its first in history. What they found was devastating. At least 10 IOC members had accepted bribes or benefits. Others had looked the other way. Some had used their positions to demand favors outright. For decades, the Olympic world had operated like an aristocracy. Now the illusion was collapsing. One member admitted to receiving $50,000 for his son's tuition. Another had taken free medical treatment. Yet another had enjoyed ski vacations sponsored by the bid committee. The scale was staggering, and it was all tied to one quiet mountain city in Utah. In America, the outrage was immediate. Editorials called it a national embarrassment. Senators demanded hearings. Even President Clinton publicly condemned what he called a betrayal of Olympic ideals. In Utah, people felt betrayed. The very community that had sold the games as a moral triumph now faced humiliation. Tom Welch and Dave Johnson, the men who had delivered victory, became villains overnight. They denied wrongdoing, insisting that everyone did it. But that was precisely the problem. If everyone did it, then what was left of the Olympic spirit? By early 1999, investigators uncovered hundreds of documents detailing the web of bribery. The evidence filled boxes, airline invoices, letters, gift receipts. The pattern was clear. Salt Lake's bid had targeted specific IOC members, identifying them by what they could be bought with. It was systematic. It was deliberate. And it had worked. The Olympic dream, it seemed, had a price, about $2 million. The walls of the International Olympic Committee had always seemed untouchable, marble, tradition, legacy. For nearly a century, it had stood above nations, beyond governments, almost divine in its authority. But in January 1999, that illusion shattered. Because for the first time in Olympic history, the IOC was under investigation. Not for sport, not for politics, but for corruption. And the world was watching. At IOC headquarters in Lausanne, Switzerland, President Juan Antonio Samaranch called an emergency meeting. The air was thick with disbelief. For months, the whispers had grown louder. Now, with documents splashed across global headlines, the time for denial was over. Samaranch was no stranger to power. A former diplomat under Franco's regime in Spain, he had turned the Olympics into a multi-billion-dollar spectacle, corporate, global, unstoppable. But now his empire was under siege. He faced a dilemma. If he protected the accused, the IOC would collapse under scandal. If he sacrificed them, he risked admitting the corruption had reached the very top. Either way, the Olympic flame was flickering. The IOC created an ad hoc commission, 25 members tasked with examining the allegations against their own colleagues. It was like priests investigating their own church. They called it Operation Cleansing. Soon, the commission's offices were filled with boxes of evidence from Salt Lake City, Letters, travel vouchers, bank statements, even Christmas cards with cash. The scale of the corruption shocked even the veterans. IOC member Jean-Claude Ganga had received free medical treatment in the U.S. worth thousands. Another member's wife had been paid tuition for her children at Brigham Young University. One had been offered land for a vacation home. Another had simply been given envelopes of cash. When questioned, most claimed ignorance. Gifts of friendship, they said. Hospitality. But the paper trail was unforgiving. By February 1999, the scandal dominated the global press. CNN called it the Olympics for sale. The New York Times wrote, Salt Lake paid the price of gold in cash. In living rooms around the world, people who had once seen the Olympic rings as sacred now saw them as stained. Late-night talk shows mocked the IOC. Political cartoons showed athletes running while officials carried bags of money. Sponsors, Coca-Cola, Visa, McDonald's, began to panic. The Olympics were their crown jewel. If the brand collapsed, billions were at stake. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted on Samaranch. Fix this or lose everything. In March 1999, the IOC held a historic session in Lausanne. For the first time, its members were called to account publicly. Television cameras rolled as the committee announced disciplinary actions. 6 members were expelled outright, a punishment previously unthinkable. 4 others resigned under pressure. It was the largest purge in IOC history. Jean-Claude Ganga, Zain El-Abidin Ahmed Abdel Gader, and others were named and shamed. Their careers ended that day. Samaranch stood at the podium, face pale, voice steady. We must restore trust. We have failed our ideals. But we will not let the Olympic flame die. Applause echoed weakly through the hall. The old guard clapped because they had to. The younger members watched in silence, realizing that an age had ended. In the United States, the Department of Justice launched its own inquiry into the Salt Lake Organizing Committee, the SLOC. Tom Welch and Dave Johnson, once local heroes, were indicted on 15 counts of conspiracy, fraud, and bribery. When they walked into court, photographers swarmed. The same men who had brought glory to Utah were now accused of buying it. They maintained their innocence. Their defense was simple: everyone did it. And to some extent they were right. Other bidding cities, Nagano, Sydney, Atlanta, had offered gifts too. But Salt Lake had been caught with receipts. The trial dragged on for years. Prosecutors presented evidence of wire transfers, invoices, and falsified scholarship payments. The defense argued it was customary, not criminal. The jury was divided. In the end, the case collapsed. The judge dismissed it on a technicality. The payments, though unethical, did not violate existing U.S. law at the time. Welch and Johnson walked free. But the damage was irreversible. For the IOC, the nightmare wasn't over. Whistleblowers revealed that Salt Lake City wasn't an isolated case. It was a symptom of a system built on indulgence. Stories emerged of other bids gone dirty. Nagano had spent millions entertaining IOC members, destroying its financial records to hide the evidence. Sydney had allegedly offered gifts and travel packages to sway votes. The bidding process, it turned out, had long been a playground for manipulation, where cities competed not just with plans but with persuasion. The Salt Lake scandal was merely the first to be caught. To save the Olympic movement, the IOC needed reform, and fast. Samaranch appointed a new commission led by Canadian lawyer Dick Pound, one of the few members untainted by the scandal. Pound's mission: rebuild the IOC from within. His report was scathing. It described an environment of excess, where the line between hospitality and bribery had disappeared. The commission proposed sweeping reforms. Limitations on gifts and travel for IOC members. Full transparency for bid committees. A new ethics commission. Age limits and term limits for members. In October 1999, under intense scrutiny, the IOC adopted the new rules. It was a revolution, on paper at least. But some doubted the sincerity. As one journalist wrote, the IOC cleaned its house, but only after the world found the bodies. Ironically, even as the scandal deepened, the games themselves were still coming to Utah. The IOC considered stripping Salt Lake of the right to host, But that would have been a disaster. The construction was already underway, billions were invested. So Samaranch made a calculated decision. Salt Lake would keep the games, but under new leadership. Mitt Romney, a businessman and future U.S. presidential candidate, was brought in to take over the Salt Lake Organizing Committee. His mission was to rescue the Olympics from disgrace. Romney cleaned house, cut ties with old officials, and focused on transparency. He became the face of redemption, calm, polished, efficient. The 2002 games would go on, but their shadow would never lift completely. In Lausanne, Samaranch's closest circle tried to contain the damage. They feared that further investigations might expose even deeper corruption. Many members had grown rich from decades of honorariums, expense accounts, and free travel. To them, the scandal was not moral, it was inconvenient. Yet the old world was dying. The media now had teeth, the internet was rising, and transparency had become a demand, not a request. One insider described the mood. For the first time they were afraid. Not of losing their power, but of being seen. By late 2001, the world had changed again. The September 11th attacks had shaken America. As the Salt Lake Games approached, fear and patriotism intertwined. For the U.S., hosting the Olympics was no longer just about sport, it was about unity, resilience, pride. In February 2002, when the Olympic flame was lit in Utah, it carried more than fire. It carried redemption. The games were a success, smooth, secure, emotional. American athletes triumphed. The crowd cheered. The flag waved. To the world it looked like victory. But behind the cameras the scars remained. The Salt Lake bribery affair left permanent marks on the Olympic movement. 10 IOC members were expelled or resigned. Dozens of reforms were enacted. For the first time, the organization admitted that it had failed. And yet, the deeper truth was harder to erase. The Olympics had always been about money, the television deals, the sponsors, the billions in construction. The Salt Lake scandal didn't invent corruption, it merely revealed it. As one investigator put it, we didn't expose a crime. We exposed a culture. By 2003, the IOC declared itself reformed. The Ethics Commission was in place. Transparency reports were published. But the question lingered, can purity be rebuilt once it's lost? The answer, perhaps, was written in the snow of Utah, where the world's most noble event had been bought with cash, charm, and a little bit of faith. Salt Lake City had its games. The IOC had its reckoning. And the rest of us were left to wonder what the Olympics truly meant. Were they still a celebration of human spirit, or just another empire hiding behind gold rings? When the scandal broke, the Olympic world had trembled, but in the months that followed, the tremor turned into something else, an aftershock that shook the foundations of power itself. The marble halls of the International Olympic Committee no longer carried the same silence of authority. They echoed with fear, with whispers, with the sound of a great empire trying to hold its breath. For years, the IOC had been a family of untouchables, bound by secrecy and prestige. Now, those same secrets had become poison. Every handshake was suspect. Every smile was measured. Inside the headquarters in Lausanne, the sense of trust that had once held the organization together had evaporated. Juan Antonio Samaranch, the president who had ruled the IOC for nearly 2 decades, watched his legacy unravel. To many, he was the man who had modernized the Olympics, who had brought television, sponsorships, and billions of dollars to the Games. He had turned an old ideal into a global spectacle. But power has a way of corroding its own foundations. Samaranch had built an empire on charm and loyalty, and now those very tools were betraying him. He was a master politician, a survivor of regimes and revolutions, but this was different. This was personal. He had spent a lifetime guarding the sanctity of the Olympic rings, and suddenly the world saw them as currency. He appeared on television, calm and polished, his voice steady as ever. He called the bribery affair a mistake of judgment, not of morals. But even his words felt hollow now. Behind him, the faces of IOC members, some disgraced, some defiant, told another story. Samaranch knew what the world didn't. Salt Lake was not the first nor the only case. He had seen similar whispers in past bids: Nagano, Sydney, Atlanta. They had all danced around the same line between friendship and corruption. Only this time, someone had left a trail. Someone had been careless or perhaps unlucky. In private meetings, Samaranch defended his institution fiercely. The Olympic spirit, he said, is stronger than any scandal. But in the quiet of his office, surrounded by portraits of past champions, he must have wondered how much longer that spirit could survive the weight of human ambition. The press continued to dig. Former IOC members began to talk, some for redemption, others for revenge. They described a culture of entitlement, first-class travel, luxury hotels, endless gifts. One member had been offered gold coins, another hunting trips. One even admitted to having his children's weddings paid for by a bidding city. What had once been rumor now became ritual exposed to light. In Lausanne, investigators worked through boxes of evidence. They read every line, every signature. It was like mapping the veins of a living organism, one that fed on privilege. Every discovery led to another. The web was global. The irony was unbearable. The very institution meant to symbolize unity and honor had been built on small acts of greed. Samaranch was cornered. His advisors told him the truth. Someone would have to fall. The world demanded sacrifice and he could no longer shield everyone. He ordered expulsions. He stood before cameras and removed colleagues he had once called friends. He spoke of renewal, of transparency, of lessons learned. Yet behind the rhetoric, the fear deepened. He could feel his own name beginning to blur into the scandal he had tried to contain. Inside the IOC, a new mood took hold, a quiet rebellion. Younger members, reformers, and those untouched by the bribes began to push back. They wanted change, not speeches. They wanted to dismantle the aristocracy that had ruled for generations. And at the center of this movement stood Dick Pound, the Canadian lawyer Samaranch had chosen to lead the Reform Commission. Pound was everything the old IOC wasn't: blunt, pragmatic, unafraid. He was determined to clean house, even if it meant tearing down walls. His report was brutal, describing an environment of unchecked excess and a culture of indulgence indistinguishable from corruption. It was not just a list of crimes, it was an indictment of an entire system. The old guard despised him for it. Behind closed doors, they whispered that Pound was ambitious, that he wanted the presidency for himself. Perhaps he did. But what mattered was that his voice carried weight. The media loved him, the sponsors trusted him, and the world believed he might actually be capable of change. Samaranch had no choice. The IOC adopted Pound's reforms: age limits, transparency rules, ethics codes, restrictions on gifts. It looked like progress. But many inside the organization saw it differently. "You can't legislate morality," one senior member said. "You can only hide it." Meanwhile, in Salt Lake City, the games continued to rise from the snow. The world's anger, so loud months before, had begun to cool. The buildings were taking shape, the venues gleamed, and under the leadership of Mitt Romney, the project had regained its dignity. Romney was meticulous, pragmatic, and above all, untainted. He rebranded the games as a symbol of American resilience: transparent, efficient, moral. And in the wake of September 11, 2001, the narrative shifted. The focus was no longer on scandal, but on unity. The irony was extraordinary. The Olympics that had been bought in secrecy would now be celebrated as an act of national healing. Cameras captured the mountains, the flags, the smiling faces, and the world forgot, at least for a while, how it had all begun. Samaranch, nearing the end of his reign, watched the transformation with a kind of bittersweet pride. The games would survive him as they always had survived everything. But the price had been his credibility. By 2001, whispers of his retirement filled Lausanne. He was old now, fragile, the fire in his voice dimming. When he finally stepped down, the applause was polite, respectful, but distant. He had ruled longer than anyone, but his era had ended not with triumph, but with suspicion. Behind him rose a new leader, Jacques Rogge, a Belgian surgeon, younger, calmer, promising integrity and reform. He represented a new generation, one that spoke the language of accountability. Rogge's first words as president were carefully chosen: "We will move forward in transparency." It was the kind of phrase Samaranch might have once said, but now it carried a weight no slogan could hide. The world wanted to believe him. And perhaps for a while it did. Under Rog, the IOC rebuilt its image. The Salt Lake Games were hailed as a success, safe, emotional, inspiring. The image of American flags waving in the cold became iconic. Sponsors returned. The headlines softened. But the ghosts of the scandal never disappeared. Every time a new host city was chosen, Athens, Beijing, Rio, the same questions re-emerged. How much did it really cost to win? How far would cities go for glory? And how many people still believed the games were clean? In the end, Samaranch retreated into silence. He lived out his final years in Spain, a man divided between pride and regret. When he died in 2010, the obituaries were kind but cautious. They called him the man who saved the Olympics, and the man who nearly destroyed them. It was a truth too balanced to be denied. The IOC moved on, but the shadow of Salt Lake lingered. Every new bidding process carried echoes of that scandal, even as the rules tightened and the rhetoric grew more polished. Transparency reports, ethics audits, public declarations. They became ritual like candles lit in a church that had lost its faith. The Olympic brand survived, but it had changed. It was shinier, more controlled, less innocent. The games had entered the modern age not through evolution, but through exposure. For the athletes, none of this mattered. They trained, they competed, they dreamed. But for those who watched, the Olympic rings no longer meant purity. They meant spectacle. They meant power. They meant business. And though the IOC had cleansed its image, it could never fully cleanse its soul. The fall of Samaranch was more than the fall of a man. It was the end of an era. The old aristocracy of sport, built on secrecy and charm, had given way to something colder and more corporate. The IOC was no longer a gentleman's club. It was a brand. And like any brand, it could be managed, repaired, sold, and protected. The world would see new scandals in the years to come. Doping, vote buying, human rights abuses, but Salt Lake would remain the turning point. It was the moment when the curtain was pulled back, when the myth of Olympic purity dissolved under fluorescent light. And perhaps that was necessary. Perhaps the world needed to see the dirt beneath the gold, to understand that even the brightest symbols are human things, built by ambition, fueled by ego, paid for in cash. The Olympics survived. They always do. But after Salt Lake, they would never again be the same. They said the IOC had changed. They said the darkness was gone. In the years that followed the Salt Lake City scandal, press conferences were held, new rules announced, committees formed. The Olympic family smiled again for the cameras. But underneath the polished speeches and white marble offices, the same machine still hummed, quieter, smarter, more careful. It's a truth as old as power itself. Corruption doesn't vanish, it adapts. The IOC had survived the storm by reinventing itself as a modern corporation. It spoke the language of reform, ethics, accountability, transparency, and yet it remained what it had always been. A private club that controlled billions of dollars and answered to no one. The Olympic Games were now bigger than ever, a global television empire feeding on dreams and sponsorships. Every 4 years, the world turned its eyes to the rings, and money followed like a tide. And so did temptation. Cities still wanted the games, not just for sport but for prestige, tourism, and political glory. Hosting the Olympics meant rewriting a nation's image in front of billions. The question was never whether cities would spend money to win the bid. It was how much and how quietly. In the early 2000s, bidding wars became more sophisticated. Gone were the days of blatant envelopes and ski vacations. Now, influence flowed through consulting firms, corporate partnerships, and cultural foundations. The bribes turned into sponsorships. The gifts became development grants. Everything had a receipt, everything had a name. The moral line had simply been redrawn in finer ink. Behind closed doors, IOC members still received lavish hospitality, though now it came dressed in compliance. Bid cities built entire pavilions to court them, not with money but with experiences. Exclusive dinners, private concerts, guided tours of future venues. Nothing illegal, everything persuasive. Jacques Rogge, the new IOC president, believed he had cleaned the house. And perhaps in some ways he had. He was disciplined, understated, nothing like Samaranch's regal charisma. He refused expensive gifts, flew economy class, and spoke with surgical precision. To many he was the moral compass the IOC needed. But no one man can cure an institution built on hierarchy and influence. Rog's reforms were genuine but limited. He wanted a cleaner IOC, the world wanted miracles. The bidding for future games revealed how deep the system's roots went. For the 2012 Olympics, London, Paris, Madrid, Moscow, and New York fought fiercely. Each city promised sustainability, legacy, inclusion. But behind the glossy brochures, lobbyists worked tirelessly. Millions were spent courting votes, legally, strategically, elegantly. It was politics, not sport. When London won, the celebration was electric. But some insiders whispered the old joke. At least this time they hid the receipts. The same pattern repeated. Athens 2004, Beijing 2008, Rio 2016. Each bid wrapped in dreams, each burdened by accusations. The players had changed, the game had not. Meanwhile, Salt Lake's shadow stretched across decades. Every new host city had to prove it wasn't another Utah. They hired compliance officers, published financial disclosures, and trained staff on ethics. Yet every few years a headline appeared, a leak, a bribe, a gift, a favor. It was never enough to destroy the Olympics again, but enough to remind the world that nothing had really been fixed. Inside the IOC, veterans whispered that the Salt Lake scandal had one unintended effect. It taught everyone how not to get caught. The new generation of members understood optics. They mastered discretion. The lavish excesses of the 90s were replaced by subtlety, the art of influence without fingerprints. And then came the corporations. Television rights, marketing deals, and sponsorships brought in billions. The games had become a business empire, and the IOC its board of directors. Decisions were no longer just about ideals, they were about profit, strategy, and brand protection. A city that hosted the Olympics wasn't chosen solely for its stadiums or spirit. It was chosen for its market potential. When Beijing was awarded the 2008 Summer Games, critics pointed to China's human rights record. Rog defended the decision, calling it a chance to open China to the world. But behind the idealism was a simple calculation. China was an economic giant. The games would be a spectacle of power, and power sells. The irony was striking. The IOC had spent years trying to restore its moral authority, and yet it had aligned itself with one of the most authoritarian regimes on earth. Beijing delivered breathtaking games, flawless, immense, unforgettable. But it also revealed how far the Olympic movement had drifted from its own principles. The flame burned brighter than ever, but the light didn't always reach the truth. By then, Samaranch was gone, but his ghost lingered. The empire he built still stood, modernized, repainted, but unmistakably his. He had turned the Olympics into a business. Rog had simply made that business more efficient. Meanwhile, new scandals began to ripple through the surface. Smaller, quieter, but familiar. In 2013, as the IOC prepared to select the host of the 2020 Games, Tokyo's bid came under scrutiny. Investigators later discovered payments to consultants linked to former IOC members. Millions of dollars disguised as advisory fees. It was the same story, just written in corporate language. The IOC denied wrongdoing. The world shrugged. The games went on. That was the new normal. Transparency wasn't purity, it was public relations. The IOC had mastered the art of surviving scandal by outpacing it. Whenever controversy erupted, they responded with committees, reports, and reforms. The headlines faded, the sponsors returned, and the machine kept moving. The deeper corruption wasn't in the money, it was in the myth. The Olympics sold itself as a symbol of unity and honor, but behind the spectacle, it was a machine powered by deals, politics, and image. Cities competed not to celebrate sport, but to elevate status. Politicians saw the games as legacy projects, corporations as marketing goldmines. For athletes, the Olympics remained sacred, the dream untouched. But for everyone else, it was theater. And yet, the world kept watching. Because for all its flaws, the games still gave us something we craved: moments of perfection, of transcendence, of shared humanity. People needed to believe in it even if they no longer believed it. In a way, that belief was the IOC's greatest protection. No matter how many scandals surfaced, the world couldn't let go of the Olympic dream. Every time a runner crossed the line, every time a flag was raised, the corruption faded, if only for a moment. The IOC knew that. They relied on it. The games were too big to fail. Over time, the organization became more sophisticated in managing perception. They hired PR firms, data analysts, behavioral experts. They monitored public sentiment, crafted narratives, and preempted criticism. If a scandal broke, they controlled the timing. If outrage grew, they changed the subject. Transparency became a tool, not a threat. And the bidding process? It evolved again. After years of declining interest, after cities like Oslo, Hamburg, and Boston withdrew from consideration, citing public backlash and rising costs, the IOC faced a crisis of legitimacy. The games had become too expensive, too political, too controversial. Citizens protested against hosting them. Voters rejected referendums. The Olympic dream had lost its luster. Desperate to restore confidence, the IOC introduced a new model: dialogue instead of competition. They no longer made cities fight openly for the games. Instead, they negotiated quietly behind closed doors, selecting hosts that promised stability. It sounded cleaner, but it only made the process more opaque. Without votes, it was efficient and uncomfortably familiar. The scandal of Salt Lake had taught the IOC how dangerous exposure could be. The new IOC learned from it not by becoming honest, but by becoming invisible. For the few journalists still investigating the Olympic world, it was frustrating. They could sense the corruption, the soft deals, the lobbying, the influence, but the proof was harder than ever to find. Everything had been sanitized. The dirt was still there, just buried deeper. And yet, even now, Salt Lake's echo remained. The people who had lived through it, who had seen how easily ideals could be bought, still spoke of that time as a warning. They called it the fall of innocence. It had stripped away the illusion that sport was immune to politics, that the Olympics were somehow above the world they inhabited. In truth, they were a mirror of it. A mirror polished so brightly that sometimes it blinded those who looked too long. When the flame was lit at each new opening ceremony, Samaranch's dream still flickered in the fire. His empire lived on, rebranded, restructured, but intact. The IOC had become too powerful to destroy, too symbolic to challenge. It was, as one insider said, the church of sport. And like all churches, it could absolve itself. The real tragedy of Salt Lake wasn't the bribes. It was the revelation that everyone, from politicians to fans, was willing to forgive as long as the show continued. Maybe that's what corruption really is, not just the exchange of money but the silence that follows it. The world had learned how much the Olympics could be bought for. And yet, every 4 years it paid again, not in cash but in belief. Because sometimes faith is the most valuable currency of all. There is a moment when the Olympic flame dies out, that the world falls silent. The smoke drifts into the night, the music fades, and for a few seconds, there is nothing left but memory, of glory, of struggle, of what we wanted to believe. Every 4 years the flame is reborn. But the ashes remain. Salt Lake City's scandal was supposed to cleanse the Olympic world, to remind everyone that ideals must be guarded, that purity can't be bought. Instead, it became something more complicated, a mirror that revealed the truth of what the Olympics had become. Not evil, not pure. Human. When the 2002 Games ended, the applause was genuine. The snow had sparkled, the athletes had triumphed, and the world had seen the United States rise again after tragedy. For a brief moment, everyone forgot the scandal that had brought those games into being. The story had a happy ending. But the truth was less cinematic. The bidding committees of the future studied Salt Lake not as a warning but as a manual. They learned what had gone wrong, what had been too obvious, what trails had been left. The corruption didn't vanish, it evolved. It learned to speak the language of professionalism, to hide inside contracts and consulting fees. Inside the IOC, reform became routine. Every few years, a new policy, a new speech, a new promise. Transparency, sustainability, inclusion. The words flowed like water, pure on the surface, carrying the same weightless optimism that had once made the games sacred. But somewhere beneath the slogans, the same old instincts remained. No one inside the IOC wanted another Salt Lake. It had been too public, too embarrassing. The organization learned to police itself, not through morality, but through discretion. They no longer denied the existence of corruption, they simply managed it. The system became efficient, self-cleaning, corporate. For the public, the memory of the scandal faded, replaced by new dramas, doping, political protests, global crises. The world moved on. Salt Lake became a footnote in Olympic history, a dark chapter closed by the next opening ceremony. But every once in a while, when a new host city was announced and eyebrows raised at the choice, the old questions returned. How much did it cost and who paid? Juan Antonio Samaranch died in 2010. His funeral in Barcelona was attended by world leaders, athletes, and Olympic royalty. The eulogies called him a visionary. Few mentioned the scandal that had scarred his final years. History, as always, had softened the edges. But in private, even his closest allies admitted that Salt Lake had been his reckoning, the moment when his empire had finally looked in the mirror. Jacques Rogge, who succeeded him, carried the torch of reform with quiet dignity. He meant well, and perhaps he achieved more than anyone gave him credit for. Under his leadership, the IOC became more disciplined, less extravagant, more careful. But the world had changed faster than the institution could follow. When he too stepped down, replaced by Thomas Bach, the cycle began again. New leadership, new promises, new controversies. The stage was eternal, only the actors changed. Somewhere in that cycle, the meaning of the Olympics blurred. They were no longer just about nations or medals. They had become a reflection of humanity's contradictions, our need for beauty and our addiction to power, our capacity for unity and our weakness for control. And yet, despite everything the Olympics endured, they survived wars, boycotts, pandemics, corruption. They survived because people needed them to. In a fragmented world, the sight of athletes from every corner of the planet gathering under one flame still meant something. It still made hearts race. It still made children dream. Maybe that's the paradox that keeps the games alive. We know they're flawed, but we forgive them because deep down we want to believe in the best parts of ourselves. The athletes, after all, are still pure in their effort even if the institutions are not. When they run, jump, swim, and break limits, something in us feels redeemed. Salt Lake City's legacy then is not just scandal. It's a lesson written in snow and smoke, that ideals are fragile, that power corrupts gently, and that even the brightest symbols need guardians. The games taught the world that corruption is not always a crime committed in secret. Sometimes it's simply the slow erosion of integrity under the weight of ambition. In the end, perhaps the tragedy of the Olympics is also its beauty, that it continues to dream of perfection in a world that can't sustain it. Every torchbearer carries not just flame, but burden. Every stadium is built on hope and compromise. And every victory, no matter how pure, happens in a system designed by flawed hands. The scandal of 2002 didn't destroy the Olympics. It revealed them. It showed that even the noblest institutions are built by people, and people are complicated. They crave glory, but they fear transparency. They speak of ideals, but they live in reality. When the Salt Lake Games ended, Mitt Romney stood in the snow, the American flag fluttering behind him, and declared that the fire of hope burns bright. The cameras loved it. The world applauded. But in the quiet after the broadcast, someone must have wondered, how long before the next fire would burn something else? The Olympics kept moving as they always do, from Athens to Beijing, London to Rio. New scandals replaced old ones. New heroes rose and fell. And the rings kept shining, perfectly interlocked, perfectly circular, the symbol of eternity or repetition. There's something poetic about that, the circle that never breaks even when the stories inside it do. Maybe that's why, after all these years, the Olympics still matter. Not because they're perfect, but because they're human. They stumble, they fall, they rise again, just like the athletes they celebrate. And perhaps that's the truest lesson of all. The Olympic flame was never meant to burn forever. It was meant to remind us, for as long as it lasts, that even in a world of corruption and compromise, We can still choose light over darkness, effort over apathy, courage over comfort. Salt Lake City will always be remembered for its scandal. But it should also be remembered for what followed, for the attempt to be better, even if imperfectly. Because that's what the Olympics are, in the end. A mirror of the human condition. Beautiful. Flawed. Eternal. When the next flame is lit, somewhere in the world, the snow of Utah will glimmer again in memory. The rings will rise, the anthem will play, and the world will hold its breath, believing, if only for a moment, that we can be pure again. The games were bought. The games were tainted. The games survived. And the fire still burns. In the end, every story has two sides, the one we celebrate and the one we try to forget. The Salt Lake City scandal showed the world that even the brightest dreams can cast long shadows. It reminded us that the pursuit of glory often walks hand in hand with temptation, and that ideals, no matter how noble, are fragile things. But maybe that's why we keep believing. Because every time the flame is lit again, we get another chance to do it better, to rise higher, to remember what the games were meant to be. The Olympics are not perfect. They never were. But within their flaws, there's still light. The courage of athletes, the unity of nations, the hope that refuses to die. If this story moved you, don't forget, there's another one tomorrow. Stories of triumph, betrayal, and the unbreakable human spirit. The truth behind the gold. Subscribe, share, and stay with us as we uncover the hidden history of the games. One story, one flame, one truth at a time. Because some fires are worth keeping alive.